It began not with thunder, but with a whisper, a leak that slipped from the corridors of Brussels and landed like an economic bombshell. Behind closed doors, a single demand echoed from Donald Trump to his NATO allies. Raise tariffs on Africa, squeeze its oil and gold, and make the continent kneel. What was framed as diplomacy was, in truth, the language of economic warfare. But in Ouagadougou, the silence was broken. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not flinch. He named the demand for what it was, an assault not on trade, but on dignity. Where others saw inevitability, he saw a turning point. For generations, Africa had been told to beg, to borrow, to bow. But what happens when a people refuse to kneel? What happens when the soil itself, rich with oil and gold, is guarded not as charity, but as sovereignty? Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is the hinge of history. Subscribe now and walk with us into the story. The question is no longer whether Africa can endure tariffs. The question is whether the world is ready for what comes next. It started as a single page. A fragment of a classified memo slipped quietly into the hands of a journalist. The words were simple, but the meaning was devastating. Washington had pressed its European allies to raise tariffs on African resources, to choke oil and gold until the continent bent in submission. In the heart of Brussels, the command was blunt. Cut them off until they crawl back. Oil and gold, the lifeblood of industries, the oxygen of economies. Without African oil, Mediterranean refineries would flicker and stall. Without African gold, banking systems would lose their anchor of stability. Trump knew it. NATO ministers knew it. And the leak revealed that the plan was no accident. It was a deliberate strategy to reimpose dependency under the guise of policy. Most European leaders stayed silent, their lips sealed, their pens ready to sign. But silence has its limits. One conscience refused to bury the truth. That night, a single document slipped across a desk and into the light. By dawn, headlines whispered of a plot. Europe, at Washington's urging, would strangle Africa's exports of oil and gold. The shock rippled like a desert wind. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré gathered his advisors before the sun had risen. His words were not wrapped in diplomacy. This is not about tariffs, he said. This is about control. They want our oil, our gold, and our sovereignty. If we bow today, we will be slaves tomorrow. By midday, calls went out across the Sahel. Leaders from Mali, Guinea, and Niger were summoned not to Paris or Geneva, but to the heart of West Africa. Within days, a closed summit convened, not polished halls with crystal chandeliers, but heavy wooden doors and bare tables thick with determination. The mood was tense but steady. Each leader spoke in turn. They told of mines siphoned by shadow contracts, oil wells dominated by foreign firms, revenues that vanished into offshore accounts, while their villages remained in darkness. For decades, Africa's resources had flowed outwards, while promises of partnership flowed back in the form of debt, aid, and dependency. But that night, the narrative shifted. It was no longer a conversation about survival. It was about sovereignty. Ibrahim Traoré, with the cadence of a soldier and the conviction of a farmer, set the tone. If they dare impose tariffs, he declared, then we will dare something greater. We will close the valve. Oil and gold will no longer flow to their markets until they treat us with dignity. The room fell silent. Leaders exchanged glances, aware of the risks. Cutting supply could trigger shortages, sanctions, even retaliation. But slowly, one by one, they nodded. For the first time in decades, Fractured voices of the Sahel aligned into a single, unyielding answer. Beyond the walls of the summit, word spread quickly, not through official communiques, but through whispers carried by merchants, teachers, and students. Radios crackled with fragments of speeches. Markets buzzed with rumors of shortages and rising prices. In Ouagadougou's Independence Square, a young student lifted a sign that captured the moment. Better to endure hunger for a year than slavery for a century. The crowd roared, not with fear, but with pride. For decades, Africans had watched their oil drilled, their gold extracted, their dignity diminished, only to be told they were too weak to stand. Now, for the first time, their leaders were daring to say no. And in the quiet corridors of Europe, as the leaked memo spread, ministers stared at graphs and figures. They saw oil shipments that could vanish, gold supplies that could dry up, and stock markets trembling at the thought. The question they feared was no longer whether Africa could be punished into submission. It was whether Africa had finally found its voice. The continent had spoken, and its words were defiance. But this was only the beginning. For if Africa was willing to close its hands around oil and gold, the true battle was yet to unfold. The question was not whether Africa had dared to resist, but how the world would react once the valve began to tighten. The decision spread like fire across the Sahel. What had begun as a secret meeting in Ouagadougou now spilled into the streets of Bamako, Niamey, and Conakry. Crowds gathered, not in silence, but in chants that shook the air. If they want our oil and gold, they will have to take our dignity too. The words echoed against walls painted with new slogans of resistance. In markets, merchants whispered about shortages and rising prices. Farmers wondered whether their harvests would still find buyers. Mothers worried about medicine and school fees. Yet beneath every doubt burned a pride long buried. For the first time in living memory, their leaders had not bowed, they had stood. The symbol of defiance became a placard raised high by a student in Independence Square. Better to endure hunger for a year than slavery for a century. That sentence traveled faster than any broadcast, crossing borders, printed on banners, repeated in classrooms, scribbled in notebooks. What could have been despair was now identity. Ibrahim Traoré did not hide behind closed doors. He appeared on national television, not flanked by polished generals, but surrounded by miners with dust still on their overalls, by farmers with calloused hands, and by engineers in worn jackets. His message was sharp. We may suffer in the short term, but suffering with dignity is better than living forever on our knees. The impact was immediate. Radios replayed his words in distant villages, on smartphones in bustling cities. Young Africans reposted his speech with a single phrase. If Traoré stands, we stand. A whisper had become a chorus, and the chorus became a roar. Meanwhile, in Europe, alarms rang. Traders in Frankfurt watched gold prices climb like rockets, their screens flashing red with each tick. In Paris, energy planners confronted an uncomfortable truth. More than half of France's nuclear power relied on uranium from Niger. In Milan, executives in the electric car industry realized that without cobalt and lithium from the Congo, their factories would stall, their dreams of a green revolution collapsing before they had even begun. In Brussels, ministers crowded into late-night sessions, their rhetoric about partnership and aid suddenly hollow. Charts on their desks told a different story, one of dependency, one of vulnerability. For years, they had assumed Africa needed Europe more than Europe needed Africa. But the numbers on the graphs told another tale. It was Europe that stood to stumble. Yet Washington's voice cut through the static. Donald Trump thundered from rally stages, His words broadcast across the Atlantic. "Teach Africa its place," he declared, framing the confrontation as a test of Western dominance. His audience roared, but in diplomatic circles abroad, the message was read as something else. The sound of an order cracking under its own arrogance. Even within Europe, doubt crept in. A German minister broke the silence in a private meeting. "Sanction them, and we sanction ourselves. Our auto industry cannot run without Congolese cobalt. Our grids cannot survive without Niger's uranium." His words hung in the air like smoke. None dared repeat them publicly, for to oppose Washington was to risk political ruin. But in the corridors, whispers multiplied. Opposition parties sensed blood. In Berlin, lawmakers asked why ordinary workers should bear the price of a tariff war. In Paris, unions warned of layoffs if gold markets were disrupted. And in London, commentators on late-night television posed the unthinkable. Have we underestimated Africa's power? At the same time, BRICS nations moved with quiet precision. In Beijing, credit lines were announced for African exporters, bypassing Western banks. In Moscow, delegations offered joint ventures in refining. In New Delhi, promises came of long-term crude purchases, guaranteeing a market even if Europe turned its back. Each step sent a clear message. Africa would not be left alone. But for Traoré, the greatest test was not in the corridors of Brussels or the halls of Beijing. It was at home, among his people. Could they endure shortages, inflation, and uncertainty without fracturing? Could the unity of the summit survive the long months ahead? The answer would be revealed not in declarations, but in resilience. The West had thrown its first punch, but the question loomed. Would Africa stagger, or would hardship forge an unbreakable bond? The counterattack from the West did not come with tanks or missiles. It arrived cloaked in the subtler language of finance and information. Within days of the Defiant Summit, European banks froze accounts linked to state-owned companies in Burkina Faso and Mali. Cargo ships, laden with crude and bullion, were delayed in Mediterranean ports. Their papers suddenly under review. Insurance firms based in London and Paris refused to cover African shipments, leaving exporters stranded. Then came the digital strikes. Government servers in Ouagadougou flickered and failed. Websites crashed. Financial transfers were disrupted. Anonymous cyber units probed deeper into systems designed to safeguard oil and gold reserves. It was not simply tariffs. It was sabotage dressed as bureaucracy. On television screens across Europe, a coordinated media campaign painted Ibrahim Traoré as reckless, a populist gambling with his people's future. Editorials predicted chaos and hunger. They assured audiences that ordinary Africans would soon turn against their leaders once the pressure mounted. Yet on the ground, the story unfolded differently. Yes, fuel prices rose. Yes, medicines grew harder to find. Families tightened belts. But instead of fracturing, communities drew closer. Volunteers distributed food in rural villages. Students organized solidarity networks to keep schools running. Farmers pooled resources to ensure harvests reached markets without relying on foreign intermediaries. What was meant to break Africa seemed, paradoxically, to weld it together. Traoré understood the game. At an emergency meeting of the Alliance of Sahel States, he spoke with blunt clarity. "They are trying to turn our people against us," he told fellow leaders. "They believe hardship will break us. But hardship is not new to Africa. Dependence is." His words resonated beyond the chamber, repeated on radio stations, scrawled on protest signs, whispered in marketplaces. The alliance responded with startling measures. Resource convoys were now escorted by joint security forces. Local banks launched gold-backed payment systems to bypass Western transfers. Engineers in Niger and Mali worked through the night to stabilize fragile electricity grids. Burkina Faso announced the creation of a national reserve fund stocked with oil and gold revenues. These were not the gestures of desperation. They were signals of resilience. The West had hoped sanctions and media pressure would fracture unity. Instead, it forged a sense of sovereignty. Across the continent, citizens began to speak of oil and gold not as commodities, but as shields, instruments of defense, symbols of dignity. This was the moment the struggle became more than politics. It became a referendum on survival with pride. Young voices on social media spread a phrase that carried weight beyond borders. Better to suffer together in dignity than prosper alone in chains. Even in the diaspora, from Paris to New York, Africans rallied. Demonstrations demanded transparency from Western corporations and accountability from governments accused of exploiting hidden contracts. In cities across Europe, activists unfurled banners declaring, "Africa is not for sale." For the West, the crisis deepened. Gold markets wobbled, refineries idled, and automakers warned of shortages. What was once seen as a calculated pressure campaign now looked like a boomerang. Sanctions intended to strangle Africa threatened to suffocate industries in Europe itself. And through it all, Traoré's voice grew louder, not weaker. His image, once dismissed as that of a military strongman, now appeared as a symbol of defiance. International commentators began to ask whether his stand would ignite something larger, whether this was not just a confrontation, but the spark of a continental movement. The truth was undeniable. Hardship had not broken Africa. It had hardened it. Analysts across the globe began to frame these developments as part of a wider narrative, one they labeled the Ibrahim Traoré coup, not merely a seizure of power in Burkina Faso, but a symbolic coup against dependency itself. And yet, just when Africa seemed to adapt to sanctions, another storm brewed on the horizon. A second leak emerged, one that would tear away the last mask of Western diplomacy and expose something far darker. If the first leak revealed tariffs, the second would reveal theft, and its shock would rattle Africa to its core. The second leak arrived like thunder. An investigative report, again traced back to an anonymous European source, exposed what many Africans had long suspected. This was never about tariffs alone. Hidden within classified correspondence were draft contracts, agreements to privatize oil fields in Niger for 50 years, to funnel Burkina Faso's gold directly into offshore accounts controlled from London. The language was chilling in its bluntness. Emergency stabilization programs, the documents claimed, but the reality was theft disguised as policy. For ordinary Africans, this revelation did not surprise. It confirmed the whispered warnings of grandparents who had lived through colonial extraction. For the young, it was proof that the sacrifices they endured now had meaning. Their leaders were not inventing enemies, they were confronting them. Europe scrambled to deny the documents. Officials called them fabrications. But the signatures, the figures, the mirrored arrangements from colonial precedents were too precise to dismiss. Financial analysts quietly admitted that the contracts aligned with past patterns of exploitation. The truth was out, and it was undeniable. Across Africa, outrage turned to unity. In Bamako, protesters stormed foreign corporate offices demanding accountability. In Ouagadougou, parliamentarians applauded as Traoré declared, "Now the mask has fallen." This was never about fairness. It was about control. In Dar es Salaam, Lagos, and Kinshasa, placards carried the same words. No more hidden chains. Internationally, the fallout rippled far. Western media doubled down, painting Traoré as reckless. But the imagery of miners, farmers, and engineers standing shoulder to shoulder with their leader resonated across the global South. In South America, activists drew parallels with their own struggles against extraction. In Asia, commentators spoke of a new axis of dignity. Even in Europe, opposition politicians asked uncomfortable questions. How can we speak of democracy abroad while drafting contracts of dependency at home? Meanwhile, BRICS nations sensed opportunity. Beijing expanded emergency credit lines. Moscow offered refining partnerships. And New Delhi pledged long-term purchases of Sahelian crude. These offers carried their own risks of dependency, and African leaders treaded carefully. But the message was clear. Africa was not isolated, and the world was no longer unipolar. Commentators began to frame the uprising of voices not as a regional quarrel, but as the Burkina Faso Revolution, a movement that symbolized something larger. A demand for sovereignty echoed across an entire continent. The battle lines were no longer just Africa versus tariffs. They were about dignity versus control, sovereignty versus subjugation. If this was the revolution of resources, the next step would decide whether Africa could turn resistance into a roadmap for the future. In the aftermath of the leaks, the leaders of the Alliance of Sahel states gathered once more. This time, the mood was not simply defiance, it was resolve. They had survived sanctions, weathered media assaults, and endured shortages. Now, they sought to transform resistance into a long-term vision. At the heart of the summit emerged a bold idea: the creation of an African resource charter. Oil, gold, uranium, cobalt, and other raw materials would no longer be treated as mere commodities flowing outwards. They would be safeguarded as instruments of independence, harnessed not only to fund survival, but to build schools, hospitals, and industries. Practical measures followed. Burkina Faso announced a national reserve fund, financed by oil and gold revenues, to stabilize future crises. Niger and Mali reinforced joint security units to guard mining zones from sabotage. Engineers across the Sahel began drafting blueprints for refining plants and regional grids designed to reduce dependence on foreign contractors. For ordinary Africans, these steps carried symbolic weight. They showed that hardship had not been endured in vain. They suggested that sacrifice could give birth to sovereignty. In marketplaces, farmers spoke with renewed pride. In schools, children debated the meaning of independence not as history, but as destiny. Traoré crystallized this vision in a speech broadcast across the continent. He did not stand before flags alone. He stood surrounded by workers, miners still streaked with dust, farmers whose hands bore the marks of toil, and engineers in oil-stained jackets. Their presence carried a message no diplomat could deliver. Sovereignty belonged not to palaces, but to the people. They say we are reckless, he declared. I say we are free. Oil and gold do not belong to Europe. They belong to Africa. From this day forward, they will no longer flow without dignity. The image resonated far beyond the Sahel. In Lagos, murals painted barrels of oil wrapped in African flags. In Kinshasa, cheers erupted in marketplaces as his speech replayed. On social media, young Africans repeated the phrase, "If Traoré stands, we stand." But even as pride surged, questions lingered. Could Africa truly replace one dependency without falling into another? Could BRICS partnerships be balanced to avoid repeating the patterns of the past? Could domestic industries grow fast enough to absorb the shock of independence? The answers were uncertain. Yet uncertainty itself was no longer feared. What mattered was that Africa was no longer reacting to policies made elsewhere. For the first time in decades, It was drafting its own roadmap. The next chapter would reveal whether this vision was a fleeting flame or the dawn of a new sovereignty. What began as a whisper in Brussels had become a storm across Africa. A single leak, dismissed by some as a footnote, had unveiled the fragility of a global order built on dependency. Oil and gold, once symbols of plunder, had been transformed into emblems of power, of dignity, of sovereignty. For generations, Africa was told to kneel, to beg for aid, to adapt to terms written elsewhere. Yet, in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré and his allies declared a different truth: that dignity is not a luxury, that sovereignty is not negotiable. What was dismissed as reckless soon revealed itself as resolve. Hardship did not break Africa. Sanctions, shortages, and smear campaigns welded its people closer together. Volunteers fed villages. Students kept schools alive. Engineers stabilized grids. Unity, once fragile, became iron. And as the world watched, the narrative shifted. This was no longer about tariffs. It was about freedom. Analysts spoke of the Ibrahim Traoré coup, not merely as the moment one man seized power in Burkina Faso, but as the hour when a continent began to seize its future. Commentators called it the Burkina Faso Revolution, a rallying cry that reverberated beyond borders, igniting conversations in South America, Asia, and across the diaspora. For the first time in living memory, Africa was not defending itself. It was setting the rules. Europe scrambled to explain itself. Washington doubled down on rhetoric, but the truth was unshaken. Africa had stood its ground. And here lies the question we leave with you. If one landlocked nation in the Sahel can defy the weight of empires, what might others achieve if they too refuse to bow? Subscribe, share, and add your voice. Because history is not written in boardrooms, it is written by those who stand. The world thought tariffs would silence Africa. Instead, they awakened it.